Minister, explain yourself. That is what President Cyril Ramaphosa has asked of the Justice Minister Thembi Simelane. This after it emerged she is deeply implicated in the VBS Mutual Bank debacle. In a joint investigation by News 24 and the Daily Maverick, it's been reported that in 2016, when she was mayor of Polokwane, she received over R500,000 as the municipality was depositing funds in VBS. The money came from Gundo Wealth Solutions, which was the same company that brokered those deposits to the tune of 349 million rand from the metro into VBS. And for his troubles, the owner of Gundo Wealth, one Ralian Radzunane, pocketed a cool 24.2 million rand. Is currently on trial for fraud, corruption and money laundering. Now, it's important to note that legal requirements and regulations from Treasury do not permit investing municipalities' monies in mutual banks such as VBS. This, from the get-go, was illegal. Now, as Justice Minister Thembi Simelane oversees the NPA, which of course is pursuing those involved in the VBS matter. NPO Defend Our Democracy insists that Simelane's briefing, her explanation, must be made publicly available to ensure she remains accountable to the people she serves. But an unlikely supporter, and I say that in inverted commas, is the former public protector, now law professor Thuli Madonsela, who has cautioned against speculation based solely on media reports. She says the legal standard in our courts is one that is far higher. We have, of course, invited Professor Thuli Madonsela to join us, and unfortunately, her phone seems to be off. But the Executive Director of Defend Our Democracy, Zaakirah Vadi, joins us now on the line. Thank you so much for your time, and welcome to 702 Breakfast.
Thank you very much for hosting me for this interview.
All right, I've tried to give as much of the context and the background as I could, and just on a casual reading, the ethics of this stink to high heaven.
Absolutely. I think it's quite concerning that there are potential conflicts of interest that are beginning to emerge. And I think that's really what is at the crux of this matter.
To be fair, though, the NPA will say they don't necessarily get permission from the Justice Minister about whom to prosecute.
I think so. I think that there are systems in place. But at the same time, our country comes from a history of state capture where we know there have been instances of political meddling in particular cases, or at least speculation thereof. And I think it's important for the South African public to have absolute certainty about the transparency, the integrity of processes, as well as the integrity of people who are at the top that preside over some of these institutions as well.
I'm going to read some of what Professor Thuli Madonsela has argued. She says, look, before we assume corruption, it's best to wait for a legal investigation. She praises the work that journalists do, but also says their standard for connecting the dots is much lower than the legal standard. Ultimately, people have to be found guilty or at least prove their innocence in a court of law.
Well, there is a case to be made around the legal matter and people having to prove themselves in a court of law. I think our Constitution guarantees people that right. But at the same time, there's something called political accountability. And as a public representative, as a minister, I think it was right that the president has asked this particular minister to account. But there's something called public accountability as well. And that's what I think we are calling for, that there has to be a sense of report back to the public about what this is about. Is there transparency around the loan agreements, the evidence that needs to be provided, etc. And ultimately, around political accountability, it is the president's prerogative to hire or fire ministers. And I think in this particular matter, he would need to exercise that prerogative.
Will you be satisfied if the explanation includes evidence that this loan was paid back? Will that put the matter to rest for you?
In some ways, I think it may answer some questions, but it doesn't necessarily deal with matters around conflict of interest. That was certainly the case while this Minister Simelane was in her position as mayor, and it may certainly continue to persist as she presides over institutions like the NPA and the justice cluster as a whole. So as long as I think that there may be lingering questions and there may be a doubt around certain issues or conflicts of interest, it doesn't necessarily instill a degree of confidence that may be required. But I think we would have to see how this case unfolds and what's really provided by the minister in terms of her answers.
The difficulty we have, Zaakirah, is that across the political spectrum, as I've been outlining this morning, I can find any number of current members of parliament who've been embroiled in all sorts of things, from alleged corruption to those, of course, who facilitated the decimation of state-owned enterprises, some who've lied about their CVs, others who passed on cabinet information to the Guptas. Some of these were criminal matters. Some of these people have never been charged, and so quite rightly they may ask, of what crime am I convicted? Where do we draw the line here?
As within our democracy, it's been our consistent call that those who have been implicated in the Zondo Commission should not be receiving any ministerial positions and should not be members of parliament. But it does speak to, I think, the broader gap in governance and oversight within parliamentary politics and our electoral system as a whole around the type of people that eventually get into parliament. And I think that there are systemic changes, whether it be around electoral reforms or potentially even changes to the constitution around who needs to stand or who could stand as an MP that need to be considered in future. But there's certainly a gap there around accountability that needs to be addressed.
You and I can talk about that our members of parliament should be above reproach. But on the other hand, one might argue, what's to stop a political opponent from throwing mud at somebody hoping it will stick?
There's a difference between throwing mud and I think a very, concerted effort at uncovering what had unfolded during a particular period of time, as had been the case with the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. There are other commissions of inquiry that have similarly investigated and unearthed a whole range of allegations. So I think that there's a difference there. One is in a very formal sense being pursued, and the other is simply political mudslinging. And we do need to be careful about those differences, because you don't want honest people who are then implicated for no reason whatsoever, no credible evidence being provided, to then have to face the same consequences. So I think there's a fine line, but commissions of inquiry are formal inquiries that take place.
Zaakirah Vadi is the Executive Director of Defend Our Democracy. I was really keen to hear from Professor Thuli Madonsela, who is, of course, cautioning here insofar as what standards we apply. And I'm asking you, as you listen, is the legal standard, guilt or innocence in a court of law, the only one in which to judge politicians? Should the taint of impropriety be enough to remove them? And as I say, how are we to prevent people from throwing mud hoping it will stick? At what point will we see politicians in this country falling on their swords because they've been caught in a web of scandal?
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.